Hi everyone, my name is Kayla Uimari and I'm an MSW student at Arizona State. I'll be discussing my needs assessment on female inmates with serious mental illness, or SMI, as I'll be referring to it as. The purpose of creating this presentation and sharing is I had to condense this research and information to 8 minutes for my school project, and I wanted to create a full presentation to share for anyone else who's interested in this research. So this is what we'll be going over. We'll go over the purpose, the data collection, the sample, key findings, recommendations, and a reflection. To begin, let's look at the purpose of this presentation. So one statistic really caught my eye. Between 1977 and 2004, there was a 757% increase in female prisoners in the United States. So why are we going to study women in the criminal justice system? Well, there are 2 times the amount of female inmates with not only a diagnosable mental illness, but a serious mental illness as well, when compared to male inmates. 1 in 13 people admitted to jails each year in the United States have SMI. Another study by Lynch and colleagues found that female inmates with SMI, about close to half of them experience serious functional impairments, while about a fourth of them meet criteria for PTSD, a co-occurring substance use disorder, and including the SMI. So why are we looking at this topic? We'll be looking at gender disparities, rehabilitation, reentry, and recidivism, as well as stigma and policy. So important definitions that we need to look at is the definition of SMI. What is considered a serious or severe mental illness? We can consider it this definition. We can also look at another definition that explains mental illness. That includes more specific diagnoses such as major depressive disorder, bipolar 1 and 2, schizophrenia, schizoaffective, schizophreniform, and other psychotic disorders would fall under serious mental illness. Again, the purpose of this study, we are going to be looking at gender disparities, treatment and rehabilitation. We'll also be looking at reentry and recidivism. How do they reintegrate back into the community? What does that look like? Are they returning? And we'll also be looking at the stigma of mental illness, including gender bias, and how this can affect policy. So I began with a literature review to get quantitative data, then conducted interviews with agency representatives, and gathered qualitative data to complete a qualitative data analysis. I conducted 2 interviews with 2 agency representatives, and then I was unable to conduct 2 interviews. So my qualitative data analysis consisted of first the interviews, which was with 1 adult outpatient agency, and the other was a female CCTRP agency, which stands for Custody to Community Transitional Reentry Program. And then I was able to develop a few more themes. So the participants include an outpatient mental health agency, which is Teresa. She's a program manager for an ACT team, which stands for Assertive Community Treatment. She is an LCSW, which stands for Licensed Clinical Social Worker. She has years of experience working with individuals with severe and persistent mental illness, and she has also led the team that is devoted to supporting individuals who have been found incompetent to stand trial. Valerie is a program director for a female CCTRP. She is a substance abuse counselor, and she has her bachelor's degree in criminal justice and admin. She's also currently working towards becoming an LMFT, which is a licensed marriage and family therapist. We're looking at some of the key findings. These are the interview questions that I started with. Some of the themes explored based on the requirements and for the purpose of the needs assessment were based on these interview questions. These include some demo questions about the sample participants. It also includes information on gender disparities, the strengths and barriers for this population, what does current and future treatment and rehabilitation look like inside and outside locked facilities? How do we improve reentry for these women and reduce recidivism rates? And how does stigma and bias influence larger policies, such as the death penalty in the United States? So other key findings, these can be used as perspectives in which to view major themes or as a guide for developing relevant questions to further the research. So we'll be looking at gender bias. We'll be looking at stigma surrounding SMI. We'll also be looking at systems issues. We'll be looking at resource disparities and how pregnancy and children influence recidivism and or motivation for some of these women. So some of the gender disparities identified throughout the literature review and qualitative data analysis include men having more visitations from social supports during incarceration. Women have more treatment and rehabilitation programs and services during incarceration. When it comes to common psychiatric and criminal behaviors, men often display more rage and aggression, while women display more depression and sexuality. Men are often diagnosed more with antisocial personality disorder, while women are often diagnosed more with borderline personality disorder. Men are often seen to have more survival skills, especially on the streets, while women express more help seeking and openness behaviors, especially while incarcerated. Women also have to consider hormones and pregnancy and children when you consider gender disparities and how those can influence treatment and recidivism. And we'll look at what the research says. So, about half of incarcerated women had none or only one previous crime compared to men who were at about 39%. About 3/4 of women serving time for a violent offense committed a simple assault, while 62% of those women with violent charges had a previous relationship with the victim. In California, which is where I currently work, about 80% of the female inmates reported prior physical and or sexual abuse, which is also highly correlated with substance use. And over a 10-year period, drug offenses for women increased in prison by 888%. So after reviewing the research as well as the qualitative data from the interviews, we can see that trauma, so from prior physical and or sexual abuse, as well as substance abuse, are both correlated with incarcerated women. Another statistic really caught my eye. There are about 4 million cases of domestic violence in the US each year, which means that one woman is assaulted every 15 seconds. Some strengths and barriers provided for this population by Teresa and Valerie in the interviews include being more open to receiving treatment and rehabilitation from professionals and institutions. And they also mentioned that pregnancy can sometimes reduce substance use and increase motivation for success and desire to avoid incarceration. While some of their barriers include a lack of co-occurring providers in institutions and the community. There is a huge systems issue and lack of social support. We'll look at how to address and improve the institutionalized and outpatient treatment and rehabilitation for female inmates with SMI or with female with SMI who have a criminal history. One focus promoted by Teresa from the outpatient agency is co-occurring disorders, and the research supports this focus. A study by Bloom and colleagues from 2003 looked at women with major depressive disorder and found that alcohol abuse co-occurred with their depression almost at 4 times the rate for men, and phobic disorder co-occurred with their depression at more than twice the rate for men, and panic disorder co-occurred with their depression at about 3.5 times the rate for men. They also, Valerie and Teresa, promoted looking at housing stability. Teresa wanted to look at the frequency of outpatient services and then also discuss the stages of change and how clients can use this for motivation. Staff at human and social service agencies should be educated on these stages to improve client outcomes. Teresa and Valerie also discussed looking at life skills, survival needs based on Maslow's hierarchy, which we'll discuss in a second, how pregnancy affects treatment and rehabilitation, and the importance of gender responsiveness. So looking at Maslow's hierarchy, why do service providers need to identify the bottom needs on Maslow's hierarchy for their clients? Such as, let's say, how is anyone supposed to feel safe if they don't know where they're going to get their next meal or sleep for that night? And if someone never feels love or belonging, it would be difficult for them to feel high self-esteem. Another approach that we need to look at is gender responsiveness and what that means. And Bloom and Covington provide a really thorough definition stating that site and staff selection are important for creating a gender responsive environment. They also state that the approaches, gender responsive approaches, are strength-based, multidimensional, and based on theoretical perspectives that acknowledge women's pathways into the criminal justice system. They address issues like abuse, violence, family relationships, substance abuse, and other co-occurring disorders. They really emphasize skill building and self-efficacy. So then we'll look at how important is gender. From the outpatient perspective, um, from Teresa, we can ask the question, how much do gender identities, gender norms, and gender rules influence motivation and goals? Teresa also mentions there is more in the curriculum for men's treatment and rehabilitation, and we need more options for women and LGBTQ individuals. She also wants to ask the question, how much does gender matter on a larger scale of recovery? From Valerie's perspective at the transitional reentry facility, she defines gender responsive treatment as gearing treatment towards women versus the traditional material that's designed for men. The facilities are designed to help reintegrate women into society. They often use stereotypical colors or just add more color to the facility in general as a way to change the setting. She stated, removing the white walls like they have in prison. And they assist with reentry support like child custody, which many other programs may not do if they're not gender responsive. When discussing reentry for women with serious mental illness with Teresa and Valerie, we went over what's essential to successful reentry, like stable housing options, funding, social support, and connection to relevant community services, as well as what's lacking in current resources, such as resources designed for release, community service maintenance, and efficient transitional timeframes. Survival skills, like how gender plays a role in street survival and what are the necessary survival skills for street survival, and the challenges for outpatient services, which Teresa and I discussed, such as engaging a client versus chasing a client, connecting a client to the team while they're still incarcerated, the ease and accessibility of services, and the maintenance, consistency, and frequency of services. Next, we can look at parole decisions. What is parole? Parole is the conditional release of prisoners, which is operational in 30 states. And the decision-making process is really based on a statutory or administrative determination of eligibility, as well as assessment of risk to public safety. They will consider the inmate's chances of remaining crime-free within the community based on an assessment where they determine risk factors for criminal behavior and recidivism. There is a very weak relationship between mental health and recidivism. However, inmates with mental illness, especially those with SMI, tend to fare far worse in these risk assessments for parole. They are much less likely to be paroled than inmates without mental illness, and this extends their time behind bars. Madajowski and colleagues from 2010 found that having a mental illness seems to have a cumulative negative impact on an inmate's parole eligibility. The social functioning and integration of those with mental illness in the community highlights the discrimination and the stigma that's present. The way that mental illness is portrayed in the media has a huge impact on parole decisions because they are often portrayed as violent, and so people react with fear. Valerie was able to provide information on parole decisions in her experience, and she stated that one, effort is important to look at, such as asking the important or relevant questions, and the effort in housing placement. She also stated that education is important because there is a lot of uneducated decision making by these parole hearing boards, and those with mental health symptoms are having those symptoms used against them in this process. Next, we'll look at how this information relates to policy. I want to look at the Atkins versus Virginia trial and the implications of this for individuals with SMI facing the death penalty. So what is Atkins versus Virginia? So this is legislation that proved, using the Eighth Amendment, that those with intellectual disabilities could not be executed for their crimes. And they used diminished capacity in the law to prove this under the Eighth Amendment. And those who are arguing that individuals with SMI also should be protected under this say that the similarity in diminished capacity between these individuals is very strong. They state that there are similarities in diminished capacity to understand and process information, communicate, engage in logical reasoning, and control their impulses. I asked the sample participants or the two agency representatives the question, do you see courts ruling that individuals with SMI should not be executed for their crimes in the next few decades? When discussing why not, they explained that there was a lack of education in the judicial system about mental disabilities. They also explained that there is some reduced stigma in the United States, but overall, many still attribute psychiatric symptoms to only substance use and do not consider co-occurring disorders. Valerie believes that the country is still operating in a state of fear because of the recent and frequent mass shootings. And Teresa mentioned that there is still the possibility of criminals faking illness to avoid the consequences of their crimes. Next, we'll be looking at the recommendations. So these are recommendations for these issues based on the findings from the qualitative data I got from the interviews and the quantitative data I found during my literature review. So where should we start? First, we'll look at where professionals need to focus in order to improve these population outcomes, such as finding evidence-based principles, strategies, and interventions, looking at resource disparities and how to advocate for our clients, and looking at the transitional process and how to increase support for these individuals. First, let's look at the guiding principles promoted by the National Institute of Corrections on gender responsive strategies and principles for women offenders. The first principle states that practitioners need to acknowledge that gender makes a difference in precipitating factors, treatment outcomes, recidivism rates, and the bias and stigma faced by this community. We also need to create an environment that focuses on safety, respect, and dignity. The third guiding principle is promoting policies and programs that promote healthy connections to social supports. The fourth is making sure services address substance use, trauma, mental health, and are culturally relevant and using appropriate supervision. The fifth principle is creating opportunities for women to improve their socioeconomic status. And then the sixth principle is developing a system for reentry with comprehensive and collaborative service delivery. Next, we'll be looking at the strategies that can be used to implement the previous guiding principles, such as adopting principles as policy on a system-wide level, getting the full support of administration to adopt principles, evaluating financial and human resources to accommodate these new policies, providing ongoing training on gender responsive practices, and including oversight in a management plan development, conducting routine reviews of procedures so they can be changed or renewed, as well as of the culture and environment to monitor the attitudes and behaviors of the team, and then developing an evaluation process to consistently assess management and services. An evidence-based intervention that I recommend is We Rock by Mizok and Carr from 2021, which is directed towards the needs of women with SMI. It usually lasts about 8 sessions, and it can be led by a peer specialist, which is helpful for funding and other issues. Some of the modules that are included in this intervention go over gender, recovery and stigma, relationships, work and financial wellness, going over strengths, and community empowerment. So what are the resources that are needed for incarcerated women with SMI and paroled women with SMI? I think the programs that we need to look at need to use gender responsive and co-occurring approaches to treatment. These can also include gender equity, looking at gender differences in correctional and community treatment, looking at the substance use treatment in and out of locked facilities, and the treatment for psychiatric versus criminal behaviors. Next, we need to look at how professionals can educate themselves and their team to reduce the stigma around SMI. And looking at gender bias, the same professionals mentioned can work to reduce the gender bias, contributing to almost 2 times the number of female inmates with SMI compared to male inmates with SMI. We can look at the study of diagnosing practices and trends. We can look at overt emotional expression, gender norms and rules, and feminist theory. One quote from Teresa on the outpatient team really encompasses the struggle with transitions and reentry. We start engaging them, meet people while they're still incarcerated, so they know they have a team and can contact us when they leave the jail. That's where we wanted to try and pick them up. If it was a perfect world, we'd be able to slowly transition them. Oftentimes they go to court that day and are then told they have to be released and then find some place to live. There's a need for a more transitional type of housing. There's a huge gap. The system's not perfect, and if they don't have family or a place already set up, where are they going? Next, we'll look at support. So data from the literature review and the interviews indicate that women experience less social support during and after incarceration. This can be further complicated by symptoms, substance use, and stigma for women with SMI. And it leads to the need for alternate support systems compared to traditional support systems like a spouse, family, children, etc. An alternate form of support already in use is peer navigation or peer support, which is an individual who has developed resilience from challenging life experiences. So they have lived experience and formal training on the issue that the target population is facing. One intervention is called MAPS, which is mentoring and peer support. So this is designed for incarcerated individuals with SMI to connect to mental health and other resources after they've been released. It's been found beneficial for non-incarcerated individuals, and then this study indicated that there are benefits for justice-involved individuals with SMI of utilizing the MAPS intervention. The multidimensional types of support have potential to improve success for these individuals, as well as potential to reduce psychiatric symptoms, adherence to medications, substance use, and hospitalizations. So with the 6 recommendations I have for improving social justice and facilitating change for this population, I've created an action plan that I call transitional support. This action plan consists of 3 approaches that are crucial to organizing a logical plan to improve recovery, reentry and recidivism rates for these individuals. The three approaches include revamping the transitional phase, mentoring and peer support, as well as interdisciplinary communication. So first, how do we revamp the transitional phase to improve reentry outcomes? Well, we need to increase the number of CCTRPs. And then I think we need to create community centers and programs that are designed specifically for recently released inmates. This could be community centers that have computers for job searches or online courses. They could also have support groups for reentry and transition to the community, which could be held there, providing a safe place for inmates, especially those with serious mental illness, to go to maintain some structure and routine after being released into the community from a locked institution. These centers and programs could also provide jobs and volunteer opportunities, and a place to go to escape criminal behaviors, negative environments, or bad influences. These centers could provide the needed safety net for released inmates with SMI to get linked to the appropriate services after reentry into the community. I think we need to discuss the procedures for inmate release from prisons, jails, and transitional facilities. Like, how does the release procedure promote the successful reintegration of the inmate into society? How can we reduce the big gap that exists between the connection of inmates with SMI to services after a speedy and unscheduled release? There's a huge need for more transitional housing options for released inmates, especially those with SMI. There's a need for female-only housing to provide safe housing options for women who have experienced domestic violence or trauma, and female-only or family housing options for released inmates with children or families. And there's a need for this housing before these individuals integrate into room and boards or sober living environments to adjust to community living outside of a correctional setting before they go into group housing in a community setting. How can we reduce recidivism by increasing linkage to services and support? So I think we can utilize the MAPS intervention to do this. Using someone who's been there and made it through the issue. Peer supports have increased credibility with the clients because they seem to have an understanding and can build trust with them. They can also build rapport. They have experience in the issue. They have built a network of providers and other people who have also gone through it, and they're able to advocate for their clients because they're passionate about the issue. So through linkage, access to services, and support from the peer, clients are able to better connect to services and peer support, which can reduce recidivism rates and improve the reentry into the population. By developing support with someone who has been there and made it through, increasing access to services, and then linking these clients to services, individuals can reduce their recidivism rates and improve reentry into the community. How do we fill gaps in the system with professional synergy? So by having these professionals collaborate more consistently, frequently, and comprehensively, providers can begin reducing gaps in services. We need the peer supports to connect to the incarcerated individuals before they are released to build social supports that are genuine and effective, just as outpatient teams attempt to do. We need more communication between jails, prisons, transitional services, and the community services that these individuals will connect to upon release. We also need to ask, have these professionals work together to ensure services are known to not only the community, but those in locked institutions? Next is the reflection. So successful factors in this needs assessment was my previous experience with the population and the issue. Gathering references and the literature review went well as connecting with the relevant agency representatives. I feel like I gained a new perspective on the issue, and I have increased motivation to pursue this issue and do more research. Some hindering factors were the lack of previous knowledge about the population and issue from many people that I spoke to, as well as myself. I had to consider the deinstitutionalization of the 1970s and some other strict legislation, such as the three strikes law, and how those things can hinder recovery and rehabilitation for this population. Considering cultural identities and roles for female inmates with SMI is complicated and complex because they have many identity roles, and how those roles intersect needs to be further studied. The stigma and bias surrounding female inmates with SMI was also a hindering factor, as well as the 2 interview cancellations that I had where I could not interview both a local jail and a parole social worker. Thank you for everyone viewing this presentation. I really encourage anyone who's interested in this population or issue to do more research, and I would encourage you to reach out to agency representatives and do your own interviews so you can ask the relevant questions. If you have additional research or information you would like to share that you think is relevant to this project, please do so in the comments. I would love to see it, and I'm sure that others who are interested in this topic would love to read it as well. I would also encourage everyone to speak to supervisors, professors, and more about what they can do to get involved and how to create their own action plans to create social change and facilitate social justice. Thank you everyone for watching.